So today I have with me Professor Gillian Russell from University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Gillian, actually, let me just ask you to just say a bit about your background, what you specialize in, that stuff.
Okay. I'm a philosophy professor at Chapel Hill. I specialize in philosophy of logic, epistemology, and philosophy of language. Many years ago, my dissertation was on the analytic-synthetic distinction. But since then, I've done a lot of work in philosophy of logic. And I tend to find that my thinking keeps circling back around to it. So it happens a lot.
Yeah. Was that your first book, I think, was on the analytic-synthetic distinction? Was that kind of like, did that more or less come out of your dissertation?
Yeah. When I started writing my dissertation, it was this sort of hybrid project that had some stuff to do with the liar paradox and semantic dialetheism. So this view on which there would be true contradictions. And the whole thing was kind of a setup, like, here's the liar paradox. If only we could solve this problem about semantic dialetheism, which we can probably do by thinking about analyticity, then we'll be able to solve the liar paradox. And then the whole middle section of the dissertation was about the analytic-synthetic distinction. And then there was this attempt to solve this problem with the liar paradox at the end. But in the end, I think it was pretty clear that the stuff in analyticity was the cohesive, coherent thing. And so that's what became the book.
Interesting. Okay. Just for what it's worth, dialetheism and the dialethic approach to the liar was kind of like my intro to analytic philosophy. I basically was just I got somehow interested in the paradoxes, and without knowing much philosophy, and found out about dialetheism, and it just kind of struck me very strongly, as it does a lot of people, and then I just kind of went from there.
When you say you found out about dialetheism, what was the entry point?
So I think in college. So yeah, in college I took a class on paradoxes, and it was fairly. It wasn't very advanced. We didn't talk about dialetheism at all in that class. But those paradoxes stuck with me. I was interested in them. I didn't research them very strongly. But one day I was just looking around, I think on Wikipedia or something, and I was like, oh, well, here's one approach, and it's like, whoa, okay. So that kind of got me started, and I think from there I just saw more of Graham Priest's work, and that sort of entered me a bit more into analytic philosophy. So continuing where we left off, I do want to flag for some people. So today we'll be focusing on talking about your work on logical nihilism, and it was kind of tough for me to even choose what to talk about, because you've written on quite a few things that are very interesting to me. So I just want to sort of flag for people. You've done some really interesting work on barriers to entailment. So this kind of work on Hume's law, right? The idea that you can't go from descriptive sentences to normative sentences. You've done some work on supposed logical counterexamples to that. And you've also done some work on logical normativity, normativity and logic, and that's also a topic I'm very interested in. But today we'll focus on logical nihilism. Before we start, though, you sent me this paper that I think is not published yet, called Social Spheres.
Oh, yeah. Right.
And before actually diving into the meat of what we're going to talk about today, I wanted to let you give a kind of quick pitch about that, because that's something I didn't get a chance to read it as closely as I'd like, but just from briefly going over it, I just never really seen anything quite like that. So I wanted to give you an opportunity to just talk a bit about it.
Okay, so it's about, I suppose, two different topics that are not normally thought of together. One is social and political subordination. So the kind of things that people like Ray Langton talk about when they're talking about subordinating speech, where one person or group of people are ranked below others, or have rights removed, or other people are allowed to discriminate against them. So that's one topic that the paper is about. And the other thing that the paper is about is Lewis's analysis of counterfactuals. So in particular, models on which different possible worlds are ranked in terms of similarity. And in a way, the project of the paper is, could we use Lewis's way of modeling the ranking of possible worlds in terms of similarity to model the ranking of people or groups of people in terms of social status or social power? And then supposing we could do that, and I think it turns out we can, there are a few technical problems that have to be solved. What would it be good for? Like, why would anyone want to do that? And so there are a few applications in the paper that are considered and developed. So different kinds of quantifiers where, in a way, it's like the domain is restricted to a certain kind of social sphere. And it's very easy to restrict it to sort of higher ranked social spheres. And then these kind of variable quantifiers that act a little bit like Lewis's counterfactuals, sort of triggering you to look at certain spheres in order to consider whether the one of the predicates is satisfied there. And then finally, there's some discussion of the pragmatics of subordinating speech and how you could use these models to explain some of the phenomena there. So it's kind of in social and political philosophy, and it's kind of in logic, and I don't know. I'm interested in it right now.
Yeah, so I was especially taken by the idea of it because I have had a pretty strong interest in social and political philosophy, though I'm not super familiar with the research, but it's just something that's a lot on my mind and that I think about. But most of my sort of work in the tradition, so to speak, is more in sort of logic type stuff. But I guess I've always had this idea that all this logic stuff. I mean, ideally, it just seems like ideally it could help clarify those questions, at least in those other areas. And but at the same time, I'm a little bit skeptical, there's always so much idealization. Those political problems are so complicated, and we always have to idealize so heavily when we talk about logic. Can that really be of any use? Anyway, so in light of those kinds of thoughts that I've had, it was interesting to see you really go in on this one topic and actually try to do that.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to both of those things, both the hoping that you could do something useful with logic, and then the concerns that you might not be fine-grained enough or subtle enough to handle these really difficult problems. I think I'm pretty convinced by one of the points that Williamson makes. That paper, Must Do Better. It's the end of his book, The Philosophy of Philosophy, and it's kind of about how to be a better philosopher and ways in which philosophy is not as good as it should be. And one of the points that he makes is that we should construct simple mathematical models of things where we can, because much of the philosophy that we do is not precise enough or not careful enough that we can even create a, consistent model of this thing. And if we try to do that, we often find ourselves revealing hidden assumptions we were making, or things that aren't quite as we thought they were. And the pressure to produce this thing that can be characterized in such a way that anyone else can play with it and sort of figure out what the consequences are is sort of revealing of mistakes. And so this important methodological process, even if it's not the most complex version of the thing that you're modeling right away, that you start out with very, very idealized simple models.
Do you have any thoughts on, so one way in which doing this type of thing makes this kind of work in a way more accessible is that it clarifies and makes things a bit more precise, and that means we always know we can know that we're talking about the same thing, and we can sort of maybe test whether something follows from the theory or not. But a way in which it makes it less accessible is that now people who don't specialize, or at least have a pretty strong background in things like logic, which is probably most people who work who think about politics, maybe are now going to feel like they can't understand this, or they'll have to do some kind of like training to understand it or something. I wonder if you have any thoughts in that about that like trade-off.
I mean, I think that's an important thought. I think one thing I said in the paper is that using logic to talk about subordination is a bit like using high church Latin to write a treatise on poverty. That the very language you've used to express what you're saying makes it inaccessible to a lot of the people to whom the topic's important. I mean, a couple of thoughts. One is in some ways, maybe that means that the pressure to do that work is on the people who can speak that language, who can do these things. And if you have this training, you might think, well, you're one of the people who can contribute in this way. But another thought is that, it's a consequence of certain social and political inequalities that people are not able to read some of these more mathematical papers. And to some extent, the solution to that, right, is that we undo some of the social and political subordination.
I see. By the way, it never ignore the sirens. I'm sure they will come back. I live in a neighborhood where that happens all the time. Anyway, so we could probably stay here for a while, but I do want to get to the nihilism. So actually, before I ask you anything substantial, I have a kind of question I'm just curious about, which is whether you ever get reactions to your work on logical nihilism that seem motivated by the strong associations that people just have with the word nihilism and not so much with the substance. Like, are people ever just shocked that you're saying nihilism and logic together without even looking at the theory?
One, but I think it's maybe not the kind of thing that you had in mind. So I was in Edinburgh giving a talk in the philosophy department, and Edinburgh Philosophical Society invited me to come and give a talk as well. And this was supposed to be a little bit more public and to have a broader audience. And so I chose to talk about this work on nihilism. And the paper, the abstract talked about how I was going to talk about logical nihilism. And after I finished speaking, there was a 5-minute break, and about half the audience got up and left. And I was like, okay, maybe that's just what happens here. But the organizers told me afterwards that actually there'd been a lot more people in the audience than normal, and a lot of them had come from the art school because they heard that there was a talk about nihilism, and I think they thought it was going to be value nihilism, and that was kind of romantic and interesting. So they all put their black clothes on and came down to hear it, but it was a little more technical than they.
I see. So it was the opposite. It wasn't like they were outraged. It was
right.
They were
I think
yes,
some people
nihilism.
actually like it because of that name. Yeah.
Okay, so getting into the actual ideas here. So before talking about logical nihilism, I want to just take a moment to talk about just logic, right? What is this thing that we're saying now doesn't exist or there is no or whatever. So yeah, what would you how would you just describe what is logic? What is the thing we're studying here?
So when you sent me some questions to look at ahead of time, the top one was what is logic, and I pretty much got lost in that question, thinking about different things I might say. Okay, so one way to think of this question is, somebody's just starting an intro logic class. They've never studied logic before. They're wondering what it's going to be about. Okay, and in that kind of situation, I think you say, logic is the study of arguments, that we're interested in what makes arguments good. And in particular, we're interested in this property that's often called validity, but also logical consequence, or in the Quinean tradition, implication or entailment. And that's the property that an argument has if the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. Right? And so we can look at some examples, but that's the basic idea. And then maybe I think you have to say, well, it's not just logical consequence, it's sort of logical properties in general it turns out, that we're interested in. So we're also interested in like logical truth and logical equivalence, and sentences that can't be satisfied, and sort of those related concepts. And really, when you think about what logicians do, they get interested in other things as well, stuff like expressibility and like richness of different languages. But when it comes down, when I get asked, the sort of core question, what's logic about? It's the study of validity. It's the study of truth preservation relations on sentences.
So, I guess let me narrow the question a little bit and say, when you put forward this idea, logical nihilism, what is the thing you're saying we should be, or we might want to be nihilists about?
All right, so I characterize the view in terms of laws of logic, right? And the kinds of things that I'm thinking of as being laws of logic or putative laws of logic are things like the law of excluded middle or the principle of non-contradiction, but also things that would have like premises on the left-hand side of a double turnstile. So things like modus ponens or explosion, being able to get anything from a contradiction, disjunctive syllogism, those kinds of things. I think like once you've started talking about the logical truths and then said, oh yeah, but we also have to generalize more than that and talk about logical consequence in general, there's a question about, well, should we go even further than that? Should we be talking about things like thinning or cut or more complicated principles about logical consequence? And in the paper, I say no, that for the purposes of thinking about logical nihilism, you should think of laws of logic as claims that have the double turnstile as their main predicate. So they basically say the following conclusion is a logical consequence of this set of premises. So modus ponens does that. The law of excluded middle does that if the set of premises is empty. But we don't do anything that says, well, if this is a logical consequence of this, then these other things are logical consequences of this other stuff. So it has to be almost like an atomic sentence with the predicate is a logical consequence of. Okay, so those are the laws of logic. And on this view, nihilism is the view that there are no laws of logic. So all those things that I've been calling laws of logic, like the law of excluded middle, the principle of non-contradiction, or explosion, or even modus ponens, turn out not to be laws of logic in the way that, say, affirming the consequent is not a law of logic, because there are counterexamples. Mm-hmm. So I think another way to characterize the view is just that the relation of logical consequence is empty. For any set of premises and any conclusion whatsoever, it's not the case that that conclusion is a logical consequence of that set of premises.
Okay. So maybe to put it in a slightly different way, although you more or less said this, but any sort of form of an argument with starting with some premises and a conclusion will have some counterexample.
Yeah, that's what the view would be.
Okay, so you introduced this in a way within the debate about pluralism, and I want to see if you could just run through that. How does this relate? What is the debate about pluralism, and how is this sort of like a part of that?
Okay, so logical pluralists. I mean, there's a lot of different views that go by that name, but I think kind of the central exciting idea is that if you're doing this project of like characterizing the valid arguments, so you're pursuing logic and you have all the arguments and you are trying to divide them into the valid ones and the not valid ones, the logical pluralist thinks there's more than one way to partition the set of arguments. And those ways can be equally correct, both correct. So to sort of put it for sensationalist value, logical pluralist thinks you could point at an argument and ask whether it's valid. And one person could say, yes, it's valid. And another person could say, no, it's not valid. And they could both be right. So they think there's more than one answer to the question, like, is this argument valid? I think put that way, it sounds like both a little bit crazy and a little bit exciting. But there's one standard way due to Beale and Restall of thinking about logical pluralism that both sounds a lot more reasonable and a lot more kind of acceptable. So the thought is that an argument is going to be valid just in case any case in which all the premises are true is a case in which the conclusion is true. And then you say, yeah, but this word case is kind of vague. It could mean a few different things. You could precify it in different ways. If you precify it in some ways, you get one logic. If you precify it in different ways, you get a different logic. But it turns out there's not much to tell you which is the right way to go. Like either of these ways of precifying would be reasonable and is sort of not ruled out. So more than one logic results. So that gets you the view logical pluralism. And the way we go beyond that is by noticing that one of sort of what has become one of the standard responses from people who don't accept pluralism, from the logical monists, is to say, yeah, but logic is not supposed to like work in some cases and not work in others. It's supposed to be completely general. Like it's part of the way logic was sort of conceived in the beginning, like how we think of logical laws, if you like, that they are going to work anytime, right? You don't have to know anything about what case you're in. So they say the only laws that the logical pluralist will get to hang on to are the ones that work for all cases, that is the ones that feature in all their logics. So in a way, they are saying, okay, take all your logical laws, the ones that are in like logic A and the ones that are in logic B and the ones that are in logic C, and then look at the set of laws that's in the intersection of all those logics. That's your real logic. That's the logic that works in any case whatsoever. And so this is kind of a way of recovering logical monism from the pluralists. You say, yeah, you haven't quite understood what logic is. Here's what you really mean. It turns out this is what you think logic is. And it leaves you without pluralism. So, of course, the pluralist is going to want to resist that move. And the way, one of the ways they've done it is as a kind of reductio on the generality premise. So if that argument, they say that in order to be a logical law, some principle has to be completely general. It has to hold for every case. And then they say, but actually there aren't any principles that hold for every case, right? And if you've been working in sort of logical pluralism and different logics, that can seem like a pretty plausible premise. So you'll have seen counterexamples to the law of excluded middle, and you'll have seen counterexamples to explosion or modus ponens. And so you say, yeah, none of them work, just completely generally. So if you accept that logical laws have to be completely general, there are no logical laws left. You get logical nihilism. And I say that's a reductio. That's supposed to be a reductio because the assumption is that logical nihilism is so absurd and so crazy that nobody would ever want to accept that. I assume that the standard logical monist does not want to accept that. And so what you're supposed to do is give up one of the premises. And since the logical pluralists quite like the idea that none of these laws holds in every case whatsoever, what you give up is the generality commitment. So in a way, my thinking about logical nihilism started with this argument. Started with the thought that this was supposed to be a reductio on logical monism, and with the thought, what if it wasn't? What if nihilism could actually be true? What if it wasn't completely absurd? What if thinking about it a little bit longer made it seem like it could be an acceptable view? And I guess what I found is that thinking about it longer made me think that logical nihilism wasn't crazy after all, and it was a pretty reasonable. So I think this is kind of the key insight that will help you understand what's going on with all this nihilism stuff, although it wasn't the insight I had until I'd been working on it for a little bit, which is that when we say that something's a law of logic, it's a much more general commitment than people normally realize. So something that could put you off nihilism and put you off like dialetheism as well and some of these other weaker logics is thinking, but it's just obvious to me that, say, modus ponens is a law of logic, right? I think about a particular case, like if snow is white, then grass is green. Snow is white, therefore grass is green. How could that fail to be an example of logical consequence, right? How could it fail to be such that if the premises are true, the conclusion's true as well? Like maybe philosophers can like fight subtly over the truth of the premises, but if they're true, right, then the conclusion's got to be. And I think in order to sort of appreciate what's going on with logical nihilism, you have to realize that the logical nihilist can concede the point you've just made, that I just made on your behalf, right? That this argument has got to be truth preserving, and that whenever if snow is white, then grass is green is true, and snow is white is true, that grass is green has got to be true as well. But that argument is not modus ponens. That's just one instance of modus ponens. And to say that modus ponens is valid is to say anything of that form is truth preserving. And so now we start to think, well, it's going to work for simple sentences like snow is white and grass is green, maybe. It's going to work for sentences of arithmetic. Say that all seems completely plausible. But there's a lot of strange stuff out there. And like one place we know things start to get strange is if you have any kind of sort of meta-semantic or meta-linguistic expressions in your language. When we do logic normally, we have very simple formal languages that we set up that behave in quite nice ways. And we know that when we try to do certain things like add truth predicates or add names for linguistic expressions, we can get into all kinds of problems. And so I think once you've been exposed to some of those problems, as I know you talked about taking a class in paradoxes, you can start to think, well, what if it's the liar sentence that I have as part of the conditional, right? Or what if it's something with a vague predicate? Or what if there's some special kind of context sensitivity? Am I absolutely confident that no matter what sentences make up that instance of modus ponens, that it's going to be truth preserving? And I'm not sure that anybody should be completely confident that no matter how rich the language gets, you're still going to have an argument that's truth preserving. And once you think that, it's not that worrying to think about logical nihilism, in part because the nihilist can take the same kind of strategy that other endorsers of weak logics take. So there's a famous thought with the dialetheists, the people who want paraconsistent logics, that lots of dialetheists think that dialethia are pretty rare, that you're not going to find them, all over the place. Maybe you're not going to find them in the language of arithmetic. Maybe you're not going to find them unless you have, say, a truth predicate or some special kind of semantic thing going on, or maybe a set of some kind. And in that case, you might think you can use the principles of classical logic in your work without going wrong. So maybe if you're doing arithmetic, it's okay to use reductio or explosion or the kinds of things that the dialetheist doesn't normally let you use in general. They're not going to say that they're really laws of logic, because to be laws of logic, they would have to hold completely generally. But they're still usable in lots of situations. And an intuitionist can do similar things. Like they can use an instance of the law of excluded middle as long as it's not an instance that talks about, say, uncountable sets or like mental constructions that we might be talking about. If we're just talking about the number of boxes in this room or something like that, there'd be nothing wrong with using an instance of the law of excluded middle in your reasoning. So that thing that the dialetheist and the intuitionist do with the classical laws of logic that they've let go, where they let themselves use them in particular situations, even though they're not laws of logic, the nihilist can say that about every law, right? So there might be situations where if your language is like simple enough and restricted enough, you can essentially use classical logic with those sentences. It just doesn't follow that any of them are laws of logic.
Right. So yeah, I guess by saying this last bit, you're also addressing something that I imagine would be on a lot of people's mind, which is the sort of pragmatic concern. Like, wait a minute, I need to like use, I need some like rules of reasoning to like get around, and sort of you say, most of the places you're getting around, you can use them, right? There's just going to be, you just have to, if you will, like just remember, like all the logical laws have some like dark corner where if you step in there, you got to be careful.
Basically what you're saying is right, although I'm one of these people that's careful to distinguish between logic and reasoning. And so I don't normally assume that laws of logic are things that we need to use for reasoning. But other than that, yes, you can use those principles of logic in all your work.
So actually, let me take up that strand. I think I want to ask you to say a bit more about the connection between logic and reasoning, because I do think that aside from the pragmatic concern I just raised, there's another potential concern that goes something like, look, if you're having some kind of debate about logic, you're gonna have to presuppose logic in order to use your arguments, and so that's going to mean that in some way you're like begging the question, and obviously you can kind of complicate this argument, but it would seem to be an argument for the idea that actually there's something inherently wrong about even debating logical principles because of this sort of presupposing problem. And so that's why logic sort of should have this sort of sort of fixed position in our basically in our dialectical practices.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think about like where to come in or where to start. So one thing that I think should be said, and this point is due to Harman, that logic is not enough for reasoning, right? When you are reasoning about like which logic to adopt or which law is correct, you are like considering changing your beliefs, right? Or you are trying to figure out what beliefs you should add or what beliefs you should get rid of. But the entailment relation or a characterization of the entailment relation is never enough to tell you that, right? So first of all, like, logic is, I think, about sentences, right? And truth preservation on those sentences. The reason I say sentences are not propositions is that I think once you start looking at the kinds of things that can be, say, logical truths, or the kinds of things to which the logical properties adhere, they're clearly sentences and not propositions. So Hesperus is first order logical truth, but Hesperus phosphorus is not, even though they express the same proposition. And so it's the sentences that have the logical properties rather than the propositions. Or I am here now is a logical truth in the logic of demonstratives, but that can express a different proposition in different contexts. And it turns out to be a logical truth because it's a sentence that always expresses a true proposition, but it's the sentence that has that sort of special property of always being true. But beliefs are like attitudes to propositions. They're propositional attitudes. And so it seems like logic and belief revision are talking about different kinds of objects. But then beyond that, once you find out that some set of premises entails some conclusion, it's not enough to tell you what to believe, even if you already believe the premises, right? Because there's always going to be the question, should I give up one of the premises, or should I believe the conclusion, even if the conclusion is contradictory, right? And you think there are no true contradictions, you don't know which premise to give up. And I think what's going on here is that, like, logic isn't even trying to give you a science of reasoning, isn't even trying to tell you how to revise your beliefs. It's doing something else, which is characterizing truth preservation on sentences. And I think one reason that logic and kind of the science of reasoning. So Harman talks about like inference versus implication, where inference is like moving to new beliefs, and implication is just Quine's word for the entailment relation. So one reason maybe people have missed this in logic is that because it's about sentences in a way, or because it's about even like schemata, it's not always super obvious in this vivid way what logic's about, right? Because it's about linguistic stuff, and linguistic stuff is in some way transparent. So we're always using, like all men are mortal, or Socrates, or like things as examples, but we're pretty clear logic's not about mortality or Socrates or anything like that. And so sometimes, and this is a pretty traditional view, people have the view that logic's not about anything, that it doesn't have a subject matter, that it's somehow sort of subject independent. And then, other subjects like, say, physics or mathematics, it's more obvious what they're about. So they're about numbers, or they're about, objects moving around in the physical world. But I think those things are every bit as important to reasoning as logic is. So, for example, if it's the case that you believe that you have 5 cents in one pocket and 10 cents in the other, then you should believe that you have 15 cents overall, right? And so basic arithmetical facts have consequences for what you want to believe. And the same for empirical physical theories. Right? Physics has consequences for what you ought to believe. I think most people say that physics is not normative, and physics is not the science of reasoning. It's not the thing that tells you what you're supposed to believe in response to different things. And the same for arithmetic. But I think logic's tended to get subsumed to the science of reasoning itself, in part because it's not been so vivid for people what it's actually about. But I think it is about sentences and truth.
Yeah. So yeah, all that's well taken. I think there's potentially something still there, but I think I'm gonna come back to it. I want to return to the to the argument that you gave for nihilism, and look at the sort of parts of it, right? So one key part is this principle of generality. So I take it that, well, as you said, the pluralists are going to want to resist that principle of generality. One thing I wanted to ask you is, it strikes me that my first intuition is that this principle of generality is something like, it's a semantic dispute about basically what logic means. And it's the kind of dispute that makes me wonder, how do you even adjudicate this? And I just wonder if you have any thoughts, like how do you have a debate about whether we should have the principle of generality or not?
So I'm less inclined than you, I think, to think that it's a semantic issue about, what we mean by logic, or what we mean by the laws of logic. I guess I can see one reason for going that way, which would be, you could say to one group of people who say, yeah, logic has to be general. Fine, you define logic your way and pursue that subject. And the other people who think logic doesn't have to be general, well, you define logic your way and you pursue the logic that doesn't have to be completely general. And now you just got two subject matters. And so if you want to answer those questions, the question is, well, which logic did you mean? Right? And now it looks like sort of a semantic issue. But I think it's not always the case when people are arguing about, whether some thing has a certain property, that we can just resolve it by saying, okay, you mean that thing with the property and you mean that thing without the property, or that's not always the most natural way to pursue it. So we, let's say, disagree with people from ancient times about what the stars are, right? So they think that the stars are holes in the fabric of the night, or the gods riding their chariots across the night sky, or something like this. And we think that stars are these like burning balls of gas out there in space. But it seems like something that's like paradigmatically not a semantic issue, right? We could just say, okay, you define stars as the gods riding the chariots across the night and go study those, and we'll define them as this and go study that. I mean, there's this thing out there, the stars, that we both have, if you like, acquaintance with. We can see them, right? And then we have different views about what they're like. So I'm inclined to think, and this is sort of a Tarskian view, that logical consequence is something that we have a bit of an intuitive grip on. Like, we can get confused about it. We can think all kinds of wrong things about it. We can mix it up with reasoning. But I still think, like, when you're first introduced to like the idea of validity, and you see some English sentences and you see some other arguments that are not valid, you're like, oh, this argument has this thing and this argument does not. And you can at least start to get a grip on this kind of abstract property. And I think we can reasonably ask as a substantive question, like, is that thing like completely general, or is it not? So I'm inclined to think, if I look at like all men are mortal, Socrates is a man, therefore Socrates is mortal. And I also look at all women are immortal, Susan Stebbing is a woman, therefore Susan Stebbing is immortal. I'm like, yeah, there's this thing in common between these two things, and it's a sort of a formal thing, and like, at least in like, these cases, and maybe cases that are sort of suitably like them, validity is something to do with like the structure of that argument, the way it's, and then there's a real like question: does that work for every argument that seems to have that structure? Do they all good like that? And how you come to resolve that question is by theorizing. Right. So in part, you look from some examples, you look for some counterexamples, and then you come up with some stories. And I do think the move from, oh, these arguments sound pretty good and they seem similar, to classical first order logic is this massive step forwards. Like, classical first order logic is like the Newtonian physics of logic. It's such a good theory. It's so much better than any folk theory that we had before it, that it's completely natural that when you first come into contact with it, you're like, that's it, that's logic, right? This is the right theory. But we have like various problems, various issues with classical first order logic. And there are questions about, are they enough that we should give up this theory, or are there some fixes that we can come up with, or restrictions? And in the end, I think the process is basically inference to the best explanation, that we try to come up with the best theories we possibly can that account for, particular arguments, but also the strange cases. And then we look for one that's like unified and does a good job in various different ways, that has a bunch of theoretical virtues and not too many vices.
Yeah, so my reaction to what you said is to say that your earlier point, that the subject matter of logic is hard to see immediately and it's kind of not intuitive, is probably what makes it seem so tempting to think that this was a semantic dispute, right? If you are not likely to see this as an object already given to you, right, then you might think, well, okay, well, you define it this way, define it that way, whatever. But you're saying, well, no, it's not, you can't just define it this way or that way. There's like this thing, and we got to figure out what that thing is. And I mean, that makes sense. I'm not sure that I'm 100% on board with that, but that does make sense. And I mean, it kind of goes back to that first question of what logic is, which we shouldn't get stuck on for. We could get stuck on for hours and hours, but we
I
should
got
not.
stuck in my whole career.
So let me. So the other part of the argument then, besides the accepting the principle of generality, is then actually the very strong claim that all of these laws will have counterexamples in some case. So obviously we can't go through all of them. I guess I want to go through a couple of the more striking ones. So let me start with the law of non-contradiction. I don't want. I mean, we could have an entire discussion on just the law of non-contradiction and like the dialethic approach to the liar. But I guess I want to address what seems to me the most common and most sort of like simple and but yet very intuitively gripping idea that I hear as an objection to even considering dialetheism, which is just if you are considering dialetheism, you have not understood what the word not means, right? That it is built into the word not, that P and not P could not both obtain. I think for most people that feels pretty intuitive and pretty compelling, and and a good enough reason to think, there's going to be no counterexamples to the law of non-contradiction. If you think that the liar paradox is a good reason to do that, then you just haven't tried hard enough to find the right solution to the liar paradox, or you haven't, or you should just bite a different bullet. But you can't bite this one because that's just what not means. What's your sort of response to that line of reasoning?
Okay, so let me start with a technical point that is important in this context, and I think it's slightly confusing. So I think knowing how it works will help people think about what's going on in these topics and find things that other people say less puzzling. So let me distinguish the principle of non-contradiction from explosion. Right? Principle of non-contradiction says it's not the case that phi and not phi. Right. So for any instance of that form, phi and not phi, it's going to be the negation is going to be true. So that's a law of logic like P or not P. Right. It's there's nothing on the left hand side of the turnstile. So I call that the principle of non-contradiction. There's also explosion, and explosion says you can get anything from a contradiction. So if your premises are contradictory, you've got phi and you've got not phi, then you can get psi, right? This totally random other thing. The most well-known paraconsistent logic, which is the kind of thing a dialetheist would want, is LP. And in LP, explosion has counterexamples. So it is not a law of logic of LP. But the principle of non-contradiction is a logical truth in LP, which means that, and so Graham Priest says things like this sometimes. He says, LP has all the same theorems as classical logic. It's basically the same logic. It's the same logic if you're only paying attention to things which have nothing on the left-hand side of the turnstile. If you're only paying attention to logical truths, right, then LP is the same as classical logic. And so here's this thing. So I know Graham, and I have said to him, in fact, when I was a graduate student, I was very excited to talk to him, and I said, but Graham, isn't the principle of non-contradiction analytic? It's just the case that the meanings of negation and conjunction guarantee that this thing has to be true. And Graham says, that's right, I completely agree. And also it's false.
Right.
So the dialetheist is slippy in some ways, right? And hard to pin down. And if you say to them, isn't the principle of non-contradiction sort of true in virtue of the meanings of the logical connectives? They can say yes, right? And so that is like a standard dialethic response to the exact point you made. But
however, sorry to interrupt you, but the dialetheist might want to say that, but as a nihilist couldn't say that. Isn't that right?
Right. Yes. So let me just go back to explosion. So the place where the dialetheist says what you expect them to say is with explosion, right? So they say that that argument is not valid. It's not the case that you can get anything from a contradiction. And funnily enough, the person who says that the principle of non-contradiction has counterexamples is actually somebody like a strong cleaning logician, or somebody who thinks that sentences can have no truth value. And in some ways, the counterexamples that the dialetheist gives to explosion and the counterexamples that a strong cleaning logician could give to the principle of non-contradiction are kind of similar. So it's not that they think the classical logician went wrong exactly with the definition of negation. It's that they failed to consider all the possible cases. So standard kind of justification for something like the principle of non-contradiction, you'd say, well, take your sentence like phi. That could be true in a model, or it could fail to be true in a model, right? Suppose it's true in the model, well, then its negation is going to be false, right? And then that means the contradiction is going to be, the conjunction is going to be false, and so the whole thing is going to be true. So it gets to be true that way. And then the other case is, it might be that phi is false, but then not phi is going to be true, because that's how negation works. And so the conjunction is going to be false, and then the whole thing is going to be true, right? Strong cleaning logician says, yeah, but there's a third case. It might be that phi has no truth value in your model. It might have like the third truth value, right? And then what's going to happen to the truth value for negation? The classical logicians just failed to tell us. They haven't told us all of the meaning of negation yet, right? They think that if phi has no truth value, that not phi has no truth value as well. And if that's the case, that the conjunction has no truth value, and then the negation of the conjunction has no truth value. They think to be a logical truth is to be true in every model. This is a sentence which has no truth value in some models, and so it's not a logical truth. So they think the classical logician was okay on the meaning of negation as far as they went, but they failed to consider an important possibility when they were doing their reasoning. And in some ways, this has a lot in common. So, I mentioned that my dissertation was on the analytic-synthetic distinction. So one of the things that happens with the analytic-synthetic distinction, especially from people like Gil Harman, is they say that when people say that sentences are analytic, they failed to be imaginative enough in thinking up situations in which they might fail. So they take sentences like all cats are animals, and then they argue if you think about it hard enough and you think about weird enough cases, you can think of a situation in which you'll say it's false. Or they take examples like red is a color, and then there's this famous example where you imagine that it turns out that we only see red when there's a certain frequency of sound that's produced, and that sound is produced all over the earth. But then when we go into space and we look at things that we thought were red, we stop hearing that sound, and so they appear differently to us, and we start to realize that things looking red is actually in response to certain sounds, not just in response to, say, certain wavelengths of light. And so Harman thinks in that situation we would say that red as a color is false. So the strong cleaning logician, in a way, is saying, you failed to think of a certain case. It's true that often the important cases are like truth and falsity, but there's also the case where sentences get no truth value. We're interested in arguments with those kinds of sentences where they might get that value. And so we need to think about those cases as well. And when we do, it turns out that something that seemed like it could be analytic is not really analytic at all. It fails in some cases.
Yeah, that makes total sense to me as a response. So speaking of being imaginative with counterexamples, I want to now get to your the context sensitive ones, because those were I found those to be really, really interesting. So okay, so kind of going along with the argument, right? Somebody might say okay. I'll go along with you on non-contradiction and an excluded middle, maybe even a modus ponens. But like, what about just something as simple as conjunction introduction, right? Just like A, you have B, so you have A and B, right? That's just what and means. Or the other one that you talk about with this is identity, right? So so here you it's like, as I see it, you kind of develop this technique for just sort of conjuring counterexamples for any kind of law, using context sensitivity. Yeah. So actually, could you just sort of run me through that strategy?
Yeah. So the thought was, if you accept the dialetheists' counterexamples and also the strong cleaner logicians' counterexamples, that gets you a really weak logic. It gets you something like FDE. And then I was trying to think, suppose it wasn't just that nihilism was a possibility that we could live with, like, are there any reasons to think it's true? But I can't give counterexamples to every theorem of FDE because, of course, there are an infinite number of them. And so the question was, could I take some principles of logic that are hardly ever challenged, that everyone thinks are obviously correct, right? And somehow cast doubt on them, somehow like come up with something that would be a counterexample, no matter how like strange it was to like, or how far out or esoteric that counterexample would be. So the thought was this, that something like conjunction elimination, right? So say you've got P and Q and you're getting P. The only way that can work, right, is that P is going to have to change its truth value across the course of the argument, right? Because, while there are logics in which conjunction elimination fails, they usually have something that's like more obviously a different definition of conjunction. And that doesn't seem like a good way for the nihilist to go because there's the change of subject matter accusation, but also you just get a different logical law, but a weaker one. And the nihilist wants to say there aren't any logical laws at all. So we're going to have to find some kind of counterexample in which the truth value of P could change. Okay. So it's a pretty common thought in thinking about language in general. We don't do this a lot in logic, but the sentences of truth values the truth values of sentences change all the time because truth is sensitive to context, and sentences don't usually get a truth value until they're embedded in the context. And the thought was that maybe not just our ordinary sense of context could be useful. So, when I think of context, the first thing I think of is like David Kaplan. And I think of context as like little quadruples of like an agent, a time, a place, and a possible world. Maybe it's not just the agent and the time that could change. Maybe it's like the linguistic context of some expression could change. And the linguistic context could be for some special context sensitive sentence sort of expressions that are like set up to be linguistically context sensitive could change the truth value of the sentence. So the extension of the expression essentially. So here's a made up artificial expression. It's a sentence, so it's not. It's like an atomic sentence, so it's not just a name or a predicate or something like that. But the atomic sentence is solo, so SOLO. Say that's a sentence. So we're going to put that in for P. So we get solo, and then I've got Q. Maybe that could just be snow is white, something true. And then we do conjunction elimination to get solo. All right, here's how solo works. Its truth value is determined by linguistic context. Yes, so when it is embedded in a binary truth functional connective, like a conjunction, then it's true. But when it's on its own, then, and so just an atomic sentence on its own, not as part of a molecular sentence, then it's false. So take this premise, solo and snow is white, Solo is true because it's embedded in a conjunction. Snow is white is let's stipulate true. Conclusion, solo. But now solo is on its own, and so it's false. So we have true premises, false conclusion, instance of conjunction elimination. So that is intended to be a counterexample to conjunction elimination. And then you talked about it as kind of a general technique for generating counterexamples. I suppose it is kind of general. It will work just as well for identity. And so one thought is you could have a sentence that is prem, like short for premise. Prem is true when it appears in the premises of an argument, but false when it appears as the conclusion. And so the identity argument that has prem as the premise and prem as the conclusion has a true premise, but a false conclusion. So there you go. Counterexamples to conjunction elimination and identity.
So I'm kind of curious how much you get this as an objection. But what do you think about or what is your approach to just the objection that these things that you just made up, they're not real sentences, and so we should not let them in. Like these are not legitimate sentences, and so that's why you think you have a counterexample to these really fundamental laws, but in fact you don't.
I think that fails to take generality seriously. I have one paper where I develop kind of a formal logic, a nihilist logic, if you like, that has sentences like this in it, right? So normally when you do a formal logic, you say what your language is going to be, you say what an interpretation of that language looks like. So if it's in the sort of propositional logic, we're assigning truth values to the sentence letters. And then you have valuation functions and define validity in terms of all that stuff. You can model something like prem or solo by making that interpretation function sensitive to position in a sentence or position in an argument. So you can imagine that the interpretation function doesn't just take a sentence, it takes a sentence and then maybe L for left side of a conjunction, or right for right side of a conjunction, or alone or accompanied for embedded in something more complicated or not. But positions in linguistic space, and then since the truth value is a function of that, you can just give different truth values for different values that go into that space. Mm-hmm. And so now when we define logical consequence, we say something like every interpretation on which all the premises come out true is one on which the conclusion comes out true. And so the move that says that prem and solo are not real words is basically saying we shouldn't allow this kind of interpretation, right? We shouldn't allow meanings that are sensitive to this. Right, and the nihilist has to put a lot of pressure on that generality premise because they need that to get the conclusion. Is going to say, but why? Right? It's supposed to be whenever the premises are true, the conclusion's true as well. And I'm giving you a case in which that doesn't happen. So they're going to regard it as sort of unprincipled exclusion of an important case.
I see.
It's so imagine somebody saying a similar thing in response to like the liar paradox, right? Or trying to introduce truth into your logic, right? You're going to have a truth predicate that you add to your logic and various things. If somebody just says, yeah, you can't use truth. You're not allowed to do metalinguistic stuff in logic.
I mean, people do, in fact. I guess not that simply, right? But that is like a sort of standard way of reacting to the liar, is to say, well, like that like naive theory you had of truth is just not going to fly. And so I think, I personally, I'm I'm drawn to the idea that, look, if the expression is coherent, and it's a legitimate subject matter um, for the logic. But I think I can see a response which says, the very fact that this is causing us to get a counterexample, right, is reason to look for a different approach to context. And I guess I wonder what you think about that sort of that dialectical move, right? Like for somebody who's saying, it is evidence that there's something wrong with this sentence that we're getting a counterexample. Yeah, what do you say to that?
It just struck me when you were talking. I don't mean this in a pejorative sense, but it's a certain kind of, like, one way to motivate this is a certain kind of dogmatism, that you think that some domain is sort of privileged. So, one view is that you might think that common sense is sort of epistemologically basic, and we start with common sense and we try to argue for stuff. But if we ever argue for something that, like, undermines common sense, then we always, like, give up our premises, because whatever philosophical theory we're working with, we could never have in that stuff, in the theory, in the general stuff, than we do in common sense. So you might take that approach to logic, right? You might think that logic is sort of sacred or basic. Certainly there's precedent for thinking of it as basic. And so whatever else you come up with, and maybe that's like different semantics or different other stuff, if it undermines your logic, then you have to drop it, because logic's where we start, right? That's the sort of the bedrock. We always have more credibility in that than anything else. And like one way to think about this kind of exploration of nihilism is saying, well, we really don't need to take logic as basic like that. We really can imagine dropping it and having something weaker. And so I think in that situation, the way forward is sort of abductive. So one way to go would be to hang on to classical logic and try to come up with, like, more sophisticated theories of context sensitivity or reasons to work against this kind of thing, and say, okay, we're going to have classical logic with this semantic theory. And overall, this works better than, say, the nihilist approach to logic with my approach to context sensitivity. And I do think, like, those are both reasonable ways to proceed, and kind of we'd have to see what turned out, to see what ended up being the best package of views. What I don't really accept is that logic is where we start and it's sacred.
So I was thinking about these counterexamples, and I was trying to think. Again, they struck me, as I said to you, as a strategy for kind of coming up with counterexamples for anything. And so I was trying to think, is there a way that you could use that against the nihilist, make it break too much? So I had this. So I had an idea, and it may be total nonsense, but I want to run it by you. So here's another sentence, atomic sentence, nihil. And it works a lot like prem, but what it actually does is instead of itself being context sensitive, it makes all the other sentences context sensitive to it. So basically what we're going to now need, I'll try to explain this. I didn't fully think this through, but this is as far as I got. So you were saying the interpretation function is now going to have this second argument that is going to take in the context, right? So we're still going to have that. We'll still have that second one, and it'll take in whether you're in the premise or in the conclusion of an argument. But now you'll take a third argument as well. And that one will just tell you, we'll just take in, does this sentence kneel? Is it even expressible? It doesn't have to be part of this argument at all. Is it just expressible in this language? Is it a sentence of this language at all? And if the answer is yes, if the answer is yes, and we're in the conclusion of an argument, then this sentence is false.
Okay.
And so now this is the general interpretation function, and it's applied to all the sentences. And so you say, or I'm trying to say, well, look, kneel is just another sentence, and we should let it in. So the fact that we're letting it in, we're making it an expressible sentence of just the logic, is now going to make it so that every single sentence is going to be false when it's in a conclusion, which means that now we don't just have logical nihilism in the sense of no logical laws. We have actually no deductive inferences whatsoever. And so this is me sort of trying to push your strategy, as it were, too far to see if I can make it be a kind of reductio. Anyway, I know I'm just kind of dropping this weird idea at you, but I'm curious what your initial reaction to it is.
Yeah, I'm intrigued. So one thought I have about it is, I think rather than changing the interpretation function, it is the valuation function that we'll need to mess with. That because these other expressions, right? So things that are not nihil, they're going to get their truth values or their reference or whatever, and then it's when we come to consider whether some we'll need to apply this to molecular sentences, right? So with solo, we just had to figure out what the truth value of solo was. Mm-hmm. And then we could plug it in, and everything was compositional after that. But with this one, the sentence that we're interested in might be a conjunction. And we want to know whether that's true, and it would be true if the nihil stuff doesn't kick in, but now it's in the conclusion of an argument, and we do have nihil in the language. So what we'll need is, given that the parts of that conjunction got their truth value separately, and then we use the valuation function to calculate the truth value of the conjunction, it's going to have to be the value of the valuation function that gets messed with.
I see.
And so we'll have this extension to the interpretation function that, so in a way, this is almost more like a weird logical expression than it is. So the expressions I was messing with were the non-logical expressions in the language, which is why the interpretation function could tell you what was going on with their meaning. And this is almost like this extra thing that's in the language that that messes with sort of compound sentences because it's there. We need to think about it and make sure we can make it all make sense and the parts actually work the way we think we're going to work. But one thing that I quite like about it is my strategy didn't actually work completely successfully, because if your language is rich enough, there could still be some valid arguments, which I haven't stressed here. But so if you have some sentential logics have top and bottom as logical connectives, and they're like zero place connectives. Top always takes the true and bottom always takes the false. And if you had an argument that was top, therefore top, there's no place to substitute solo.
I see. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There's no sentential variables. And so that argument is still going to be truth preserving. And in the paper, I just say, if it turns out that the only arguments that are truth preserving are things that don't have any way you can substitute any expressions in that are non-logical, then logic ends up being this incredibly tiny esoteric subject that doesn't tell us anything about even arithmetic or like tigers or anything, anywhere we might have wanted to use logic. But this might be like something like this might be a way around even those like hanging on cases of arguments that are still going to be valid. If you mess with the evaluation function as well as the interpretation function.
But then, so what do you think about the danger, or maybe it's not a danger, maybe you would just bite this bullet. Although I mean, yeah, I mean, again, as you said, we'd have to work out exactly how this works, but at least as I was thinking of it, it would imply that there's just no deductive inferences whatsoever. And so that just seems like a much stronger conclusion than the original nihilism that you wanted to argue for.
So to me, it seems exactly like the original nihilism that I was going to argue for. But maybe I misunderstood you.
Yeah, maybe. So my thinking is that, if the mere presence of this nihil, I was thinking of it as a sentence, but maybe as you said, maybe it's more of a logical connective. But whatever it is, the mere presence of it, right, is going to make all of these sentences be false when they appear in a conclusion. That's going to apply just to all sentences, period, right? Regardless of whether this sentence is in the argument. So it is now no longer the case that, that, say, a certain law doesn't hold because it has counterexamples. Every specific instance is a counterexample.
Oh, okay, that does sound stronger than the view that I had. Yes. So yeah, my view is there was going to be at least one counterexample to every logical law. Not that there were going to be no truth-preserving arguments, or like they would be truth-preserving, just not completely generally truth-preserving in virtue of being of that form. So yeah, I don't quite see how that works yet. So if snow is white, then grass is green. Snow is white, therefore grass is green. I think it can be a sentence, right? Your thing in the language is supposed to kind of change the meaning of snow is white and grass is green, so that it's.
Well, let's take a. So you said if snow is white, then grass is green. Okay, so the conclusion here is grass is green, right? So now for that sentence, grass is green, you have to look, is this in the premise or in the conclusion? It's in a conclusion. Is nihil in this language? Yes, it is. When both those things hold, the value of the sentence is false. Therefore, that argument is not truth-preserving.
Okay, but I think that's worked by changing the meaning of grass is green.
Okay. Now,
right, so, and the reason I think that is because its truth conditions have changed.
I see.
Right.
Now, why is that not the case with, just say, with prem?
Because I invented prem. It wasn't in the language for me to change its truth conditions.
Yeah.
So we get these counterexamples by coming up with like these new expressions that have new meanings, but their meanings are like sensitive to a variable that we don't normally pay attention to. It's part of my view that there can be expressions which are not so sensitive or which are sort of trivially insensitive, so they get the same value for every, no matter whether you put them on the left-hand side or the right-hand side of the conjunction or in the premises or the conclusion. And since the nihilism is supposed to be committed to this sort of great generality, no matter which language you're using, it's supposed to work, even when you're using one of these sort of stable languages that's not sensitive to these changes.
Right.
So I think your language is one that kind of erases, like it doesn't have some of the expressions we have in English. So it may be a language in which there are no arguments that even preserve truth, never mind, everything of that form preserves truth.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that English is like that.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that makes sense. And when I was thinking about this, certainly my thought is, I thought of this in a way, as I said before, of like trying to see, can I take a strategy like yours and push it too far? And I'm aware of the fact that I've pushed it further by doing something substantially different, which is coming up with something that doesn't just have a weird meaning itself, but is supposed to like infect the meanings of all the other sentences, right? And so I guess the obvious thing that I'm doing, that Neil is doing, that say Prem is not doing, that maybe would make us think, Prem is okay and Neil isn't, is that I'm saying Neil is allowed to, in this way, infect the meanings of all the sentences. And I guess the very general point I wanted to raise, and I guess you maybe have already addressed it, but the very general point I wanted to raise with this is, what if we have this kind of attitude of, if it's coherent, let it in. Why not let in a sentence that does work in this way by in fact infecting all the other sentences, right? So, what is the sort of what is the kind of standard or that we're using in order to say that? And I guess in a way, what you've said is, well, we want to, since we're talking about generality, we also want to be able to talk about sentences that are not vulnerable to this weird Neil thing. Is that roughly what you're saying?
I mean, not vulnerable may be too strong. So suppose we do introduce nihil to English. I think that would like change the meanings of natural language sentences because they would have different truth conditions. We can do that, and then if everything works the way we thought it was working, we end up with a language with no truth-preserving arguments at all. There are no arguments with all true premises and a true conclusion. But it doesn't follow that, like, in any language whatsoever, there are no arguments with all true premises and a true conclusion. It seems like in that language there's things we can't say, right? For example, we can't say grass is green.
Yeah. Yeah, I get your point. Where I hesitate is in saying, well, if we want to talk about, what I was going to say is that if we want to talk about complete generality, we should be able to say grass is green, but we should also be able to have Neil, right?
So I'm saying you can make that change, and you would end up with a language without any truth-preserving arguments, but it would still be the case that English, like as we currently speak it, has truth-preserving arguments.
Yeah. Okay, well, thanks for indulging me in that. It was just kind of like a weird little experiment to see if I could push your idea too far. But I think your reaction makes sense.
Thinking about this is worthwhile, and pushing ideas too far is like how you figure things out, and it can be fruitful.
So I wanted to ask you, so moving on from that, I want to now ask you about your response, in a way, to the arguments for nihilism. Because you, after giving the arguments for nihilism, you say, well, now we're in a situation where either we're going to want to say, oh no, there's no logic, what a disaster, right? Or we're going to have to take this attitude of monster barring, right? No, don't let the monsters in. Kind of what I was trying to say earlier, like, well, maybe we shouldn't let those weird sentences in. And you say there's a third way. So if you can kind of like give what that is.
Yeah, so in the last part of the paper on nihilism, I talk about what our response should be to these kinds of strange arguments with Solo and Prem. As you suggested, like one way to go is to say, that's the end of logic. Like, farewell. Like, it's been fun, but right. And that seems ridiculous, but also I like logic. And there are all kinds of important things in logic that I don't want to lose. Like all the progress we made in the 20th century in logic, like it seems ridiculous to like drop that in response to these kinds of arguments. And then there's another response, which is just to say, these counterexamples don't count. And moreover, it's kind of obvious that they don't count because, and like one way that I imagine you can go is you can say the arguments you're giving are not actually like instances of, say, identity or conjunction elimination, because the instances are only supposed to involve, I don't know, certain kinds of interpretation or certain kinds of substitution, and it's like restricted and so this is not allowed. So in the paper, like there's a character who thinks they knew right from the beginning what uniform substitution was supposed to look like, and it clearly rules out substituting Solo in for whatever sentence you had as the premise. I think there's a third way to go, and you get the third way by thinking about some of the methodological points that Lakatos made in this book, Proofs and Refutations, which is this incredibly cool, compelling dialogue in the epistemology of geometry. And in this dialogue, there's a teacher talking to students about Euler's lemma, which is this equation that relates like the number of faces and the number of edges and the number of vertices in a polyhedron. The students come up with this equation and they test it on a few cases, like on a pyramid and on a cube, and it works well for those. And so now there's a question, does it work for all polyhedra? And the teacher gives them a proof that it does. And so the proof is kind of, it's nice. You like imagine the polyhedron made out of a rubber sheet. And then you have to cut out one face from this polyhedron and then stretch it flat and like chop it into triangles. And when you do this and you think about it, it turns out that this equation had to be correct for the original polyhedron before you started chopping it up. Okay, so we had this conjecture about the relationship between the vertices, the faces, and the edges. We've now proved this conjecture. And now something weird happens. The students start to generate counterexamples to this theorem, the thing that's been proved. And the counterexamples are all a bit weird. So one of them is like there's a larger cube and a smaller cube stuck on the side. And then the equation doesn't work. Or there are two cubes nested inside each other. Or there's kind of a picture frame example, and the equation doesn't work for that. And one of the students is like, why are we still talking about this so-called theorem? Like, we've refuted it. We've got rid of it. We've got all these counterexamples. But of course, it's not that simple because there was a proof of the theorem, right? And if you have a proof of a theorem and then you have some weird counterexamples, you've just got a puzzle as to what's going on there. And then there's another student who says, why are we talking about these counterexamples? They're monsters. They're not real counterexamples. They're silly. Like, we didn't mean that by polyhedron. Like, it doesn't count if you stick two cubes together. It doesn't count if you make nested cubes. And so the teacher is like, well, what does count as a polyhedron? And so the student keeps developing definitions of polyhedron. And then another counterexample will come along that meets this definition of a polyhedron but violates the theorem. And so the student who like keeps changing the definition of polyhedron and pretending that's what we meant all along that's the monster barring student. They're like, no, my theorem, I'm hanging on to it. I've proved it. It's pretty. It's general. I'm not letting go. That's classical logic in the analogy. And the student who is like, burn it all to the ground, like we've shown that it's all wrong. That's the nihilist who's like, there's no laws of logic whatsoever. But Lakatos thinks that the student who is just monster barring, who refuses to really look at these counterexamples and is sort of saying, no, I meant all along that doesn't count, they're like passing up the opportunity to figure out what's going on in these cases and kind of learn how they're undermining the theorem. And the student who's just giving up the theorem is obviously giving up all the work that's gone into proving it, which was like interesting and had particular insights. And so what Lakatos recommends, or the teacher recommends, I guess this is Lakatos's view, is this thing you do called lemma incorporation. So you find your counterexample and you go through the proof, like line by line, till you find an assumption that you made in the proof that's violated by this counterexample. So, for example, the nested cubes, it's not the case that you can cut out one face if they're made out of rubber and then stretch the result flat, because like the nested cube kind of gets in the way. And so you were assuming that it was possible to do that, but in fact it's not with certain examples. Or same with the picture frame kind of example. And so you use that violation of an assumption to restrict the statement of the conclusion, right? And what you end up with is a proof based on that assumption that now says, as long as the simple way to put it would be, as long as you can like cut out a face and stretch it flat on a plane. But I think Lakatos actually calls it like, as long as the polyhedron is connected in a certain way, right, then the following theorem holds. But now, you've sort of opened up this opportunity to study the funny cases, like what happens if it's not connected? What happens, are there different kinds of counterexamples, and do they give some sort of systematic results about the relationship between the faces and the edges and the vertices? And so the suggestion is that we do the same here, that we go through, say, the proof of the law of excluded middle, or the proof of explosion, or the proof of identity, and then see what assumption was made is violated by the counterexample. And sometimes it's fairly clear. So like one of the assumptions was that every sentence had one of two truth values, true or false, right? But that also means that now you have this restricted theorem available, right, which you still have a proof of, that says, as long as you are only looking at a language in which every sentence is either true or false, and not both and not neither, then the law of excluded middle holds, then explosion holds. But that leaves you open to start investigating the other cases and see what kind of logic you can have there.
Yeah, so that made a lot of sense to me, and it seems to me like, it's a good sort of resolution to the whole dialectic that you present, to say, well, okay, now if we just assume that you're in a bivalent context or whatever, then you have this kinds of rules. My question was, can you reinterpret that so that you end up back with laws? And here's what I mean. Something like, well, instead of saying like, well, if you are in a bivalent context, then you have the law of excluded middle. Why can't you just say, it is a law that if phi is bivalent, then phi or not phi. Why doesn't that just mean you now have that type of law?
So I think I'm sympathetic to the spirit of this suggestion. So I essentially think that what logic you end up with depends a little bit on the kind of features that expressions in your language have. If they're capable of, say, vagueness, you might want to represent their interpretations with incomplete functions, and so you might get, maybe something like a strong Kleene logic, whereas if they're not capable of that vagueness, you might think they get either true or false as a value, and so classical logic might come out of that. And then I think it would be correct to say these things like, for all bivalent sentences, phi or not phi, is like a law restricted to that language. So that's not a law in the sense that I characterize at the beginning of the paper. So in a way, the nihilist only gets their conclusion by saying, here's my conception of a law, I'm sticking with it. It's got to be completely general, and it's got to be syntactically like this, right? Although that's how you get nihilism, and the nihilist can be sort of basically right that if you insist on that conception of a law, that's what you get. There's no reason we have to stick with that conception of a law. And so, I think it would be reasonable to call my view actually a kind of pluralism in the end, that it depends on your language what your logic comes out as. But then the further question, can you sort of import the restrictions into the law itself so that you end up with something like just a turnstile, and then if it's bivalent, then such and such and such and such? I suspect it's going to be a little bit more difficult than it looks. Just because, bivalent might get no truth value, and then, phi is bivalent might get no truth value, and I think weird things could happen with that, but maybe.
Okay. I have one more question for you, and that is, since you first started publishing about this, I'm just kind of curious, what is the best or for you most compelling or most troubling kind of objection to your approach that you've heard that isn't so technical that you couldn't explain it here?
Yeah, no, I'm just thinking. So, there's a point that Williamson makes when he's talking about non-classical logics, which is they lack a certain virtue that classical logic has, and that virtue is strength. In a particular sense, so it's not just that they're stronger logics, you can prove more theorems. It's also that they're sort of more precise. That classical logic is more precise and informative in the following kind of way that classical logic says the law of excluded middle, you can have that any time, right? No matter what language you're using or whatever, help yourself to the law of excluded middle. It's always okay to use it. But any kind of weaker logic that says that's not a law, but you can use it sometimes, tends to be a bit vaguer on when you can use it. So we have these thoughts about classical recapture that you can probably use the law of excluded middle in these situations, or if there are no vague predicates, or like things like that. But it's nowhere near as precise as writing a logic for this thing. And so I think we tend to be a bit hand-wavy about the classical recapture stuff, and so we tend to be less informative. That's like a contingent feature of the weaker logics, right? Because we could do it more carefully. We could, have equally well-developed theories of classical recapture of when all these instances of the law of excluded middle are acceptable. But the worry is that when we try to do that, our theories are going to look really ad hoc. That we'll end up with the weaker logic plus a bunch of ugly rules. And then when classical logic has just this very general, all these things, you can always use them. It's neat, right? It's elegant. And so I think one concern is how weaker logics are going to develop in such a way that they seem as powerful, that they seem as explanatory as classical logic does. I think that's a real challenge.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. This has been really helpful for me in understanding this, and I also just, I think just a really good sort of introduction to this whole idea. So I really appreciate it.
I really enjoyed talking to you. Thank you for all the ideas.
And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber? Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.